Africa. As powerful as the storm would become in its infancy, its winds were only about 30 miles per hour, according to a ship that, based upon subsequent investigations, is believed to have first encountered it on the 28th of August. Now, most tropical disturbances of this type just kinda dissipate before they have the chance to do anything. For example, they might run into some powerful westerly winds that blow away their thunderheads, or alternatively, they might simply encounter patches of cold water that sap their strength. That being said, if something like that doesn't happen, the disturbance might start to develop thunderstorms and eventually start to rotate. Such disturbances, under the right circumstances, are the types of storms that could develop into hurricanes. This particular tropical disturbance is believed to have entered the Caribbean Sea on the 31st of August. The first bit of land this storm then encountered was St. Kitts, where it deposited heavy amounts of rain on the island. Notably, though, unlike a normal storm that would weaken after releasing its moisture, this storm only got bigger after passing over St. Kitts. Basically, as best I understand it, under normal circumstances, rain eventually depletes the clouds it comes from, causing them to stop being storm clouds. Essentially, there is a point in a normal storm where the amount of rain falling from the cloud exceeds the amount of moisture it's picking up, at which point the storm dissipates. Hurricanes are different, though, because their winds are powerful enough to prevent this from happening. Essentially, their high winds are creating a situation where they are driving so much water vapor up into the air and into the clouds that instead of dissipating, the storm only grows stronger. Now, in 1900 in the United States, the people responsible for studying such things and predicting the weather typically belong to the U.S. Weather Bureau. The thing is, while we today generally just take the idea of weather forecasting for granted, that was not always the case. Some, for example, held that man should not try to predict the weather. Such individuals believed that weather was the domain of God, and thus man should not meddle in such affairs, or even attempt to understand how such things work. Others, meanwhile, simply saw mankind as not being capable of understanding, much less predicting the weather, so it was foolish to even try. That being said, people had long been fascinated by the weather. In fact, Americans in particular seem to have a tradition of recording weather events. Thomas Jefferson, for example, kept a weather journal for much of his life, in which he recorded things like daily temperatures and conditions. This also wasn't just some quirk of Jefferson's, as such journals were fairly common. Yet, to be clear, these were simply documents that recorded conditions and weather events that happened. These were typically not real attempts to understand the weather and why things happened when they did, because again, more than a few people believe such a thing impossible by man. In addition to this attitude that the Weather Bureau is meddling around with things they could not hope to understand, the Bureau, which was a part of the U.S. Signal Corps, often found itself plagued by scandal. For example, in 1881, Captain Henry Howgate, the chief financial manager of the Signal Corps, managed to embezzle nearly $250,000, an amount which may not sound like all that much today, but keep in mind this was a time when a fancy dinner could set you back a grand total of 35 cents. So $250,000 was quite a hefty sum in those days. In fact, it appears to have been roughly equivalent to more than $7.5 million today, which you know was bad enough, but Howgate then made the government look even more incompetent when he escaped after being convicted and jailed when he was allowed to go home and visit his daughter. In the wake of this significant black eye for the Signal Corps, Secretary of War Robert T. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, would launch an investigation into the Signal Corps as a whole. However, this investigation had a special focus on his controversial Weather Bureau, which, as it turned out, had very few financial controls in place, something that likely aided Howgate in his whole embezzling scheme. They also found that the Weather Bureau had few experienced forecasters in its ranks, which may have been due to the fact that the training for the Bureau seemed to be more focused on cavalry drills than the actual job of predicting the weather, which was, supposed to be their job. The thing was, they really didn't focus on actual weather forecasting as a part of their training, because the reality was few would ever actually be trusted with that job. You see, with the public already in general skeptical of the Bureau's ability to predict the weather, the last thing they wanted was every Tom, Dick, and Harry who signed up to join the Bureau to issue their own forecasts, as everyone they got wrong would just make the Weather Service look that much more incompetent. As such, only the best of the best would get sent into the field to become assistant observers at the Weather Bureau's posts across the country. Then, as these trainees sent off to their new assignments, they were expected to choose something scientific and related to meteorology to study while at their assigned weather stations. The expectation being this scholarly scientific pursuit would keep them busy and occupied while they were conducting their routine scientific observation duties, as who knows what kinds of mischief one could get up to in all the free time they had when they weren't taking readings. Yet, despite these precautions, not all the recruits took their duties or their chosen scientific pursuits all that seriously, as in the years to come more scandals would plague the Bureau. This latest bit of bad press for the Bureau would have its origins in 1887 when General Adolphus W. Greely was made the new head of the Signal Corps. Now, Greely was quite the famous figure at the time, although his fame mainly seems to stem from the time that he had to be rescued from certain death after his failed 1881 Arctic expedition, which, in addition to being tasked with making a number of scientific and meteorological examinations, had also been tasked with locating the lost ship the Jeannette, which had disappeared in the Arctic 2 years earlier, meaning that Greely and his men were continuing the long tradition of Arctic expeditions sent to rescue other Arctic expeditions, in a seeming never-ending cycle of boy, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Regardless, Greely, now in charge of the Signal Corps, was focused on reforming and shaping up the Weather Bureau in particular. His goal then was to purge the organization of any men who was either neglecting their duties or who were simply not of good upstanding character. To that end, he sent inspectors out to actually check in on the Bureau's far-flung outposts and the men who were supposed to be operating them. These inspectors then subsequently found that more than a few of the Weather Bureau's observers had become quite lax in their duties. One inspector, for example, would arrive to find the local Weather Bureau office completely empty, which wasn't good, but what was probably worse was the stack of weather reports he found at the local telegraph office, dated to be sent out so it would look like the observer was still at the office, when in fact they were on a week-long fishing trip. Then there was the one observer who had pawned his station's instruments to pay off his gambling debts, a situation that resulted in this observer paying daily visits to the pawn shop in question to take his measurements to make his reports. Those two men would be dismissed as their activities were interfering with their jobs to one degree or another. Other observers, meanwhile, would be dismissed due to having questionable character. One forecaster, for example, would be investigated due to rumors that he regularly hosted women in his apartment. What made this particularly scandalous, though, was that some of these women were of quote-unquote questionable morality, and according to rumors, some of these women were even married. In fact, the investigator had heard tale of one woman in particular whose husband had broken into the forecaster's apartment hoping to catch her and the man from the Weather Bureau together. The forecaster in question, however, managed to escape his apartment before the husband could make it inside, and after locking said woman inside his wardrobe. The story doesn't end there, though, as according to these rumors, the husband, upon finding no one in the apartment, wasn't dissuaded. Indeed, he even suspected that his unfaithful wife was locked inside said wardrobe, so he fired his gun into the piece of furniture. Luckily, again according to this second-hand story, the woman was quite petite, and so the forecaster had hidden her on the top shelf of his wardrobe, well above where her husband had fired his gun. So the woman in question was still quite alive when the forecaster's friend later arrived at the apartment with the key to free her. Now, while this colorful tale stands out, apparently this young weatherman was far from alone in wooing women they weren't married to, nor was he apparently alone in having affairs with married women. So, upon investigation, if there was evidence of such improprieties, the Weather Bureau employees would be dismissed, regardless of whether or not their extracurricular activities had any effect upon their duties or not, because the Weather Bureau could not have its already less than stellar name connected to such characters. One observer, for example, would be fired for combining his love of women and photography while on the job, as he apparently turned his official Weather Bureau office into a studio, wherein he photographed various young women who posed for him while nude. In all, over 100 employees of the Weather Bureau were ultimately fired for offenses which included but were not limited to changing reports, dereliction of duty, insubordination, not paying debts, and grave robbing, an offense which we frustratingly have no further information on. I assume it was just a kind of side hustle and they were making extra money getting bodies from medical schools, or at least that's my hope. As for the Bureau, this process of ridding itself of such questionable characters held even more importance when it suffered yet another serious black eye in terms of public perception when in March 1888 it seriously botched its New York forecast. To be clear, this wasn't your normal "it's raining" despite the local weather guy predicting it was going to be a sunny day type of thing. You see, the Bureau's prediction was for fair if a bit cold and brisk weather. What New York got instead, though, was a blizzard that dropped 21 inches of snow and that led to the deaths of 200 people. This then was more than just a run-of-the-mill screw-up. The whole purpose of the Weather Bureau was to predict such major weather events so as to protect people from them, and they had failed spectacularly on a major stage. Justifiably then, much of the nation was skeptical of the Weather Bureau and its usefulness. Yet, as bad as this public perception was, what was worse was the fact that the Secretary of Agriculture J. Sterling Morton didn't think highly of the Weather Service either. Now, what made Morton's opinion carry significantly more weight than your average American citizen was the fact that as Secretary of Agriculture, he was in control of the Signal Corps, which again the Weather Bureau was a part of. So it really wasn't a good sign for the Weather Bureau that Morton saw it as a waste of money. In particular, he thought the Bureau scientists were far too well paid considering how not good they seemed to be at their job of predicting the weather, which kind of explains why Mark Harrington, who took over for Greeley as the head of the Signal Corps, forbade his people from predicting temperatures more than 24 hours ahead of time because he feared that every wrong prediction would only further undermine the public's trust in the Bureau. And while part of me wants to say that had Harrington allowed his people to actually be more proactive in doing their jobs, they might have had a better record to point to, the reality of human nature is such that probably no matter how many times they were right, the times when they got things wrong would still be more memorable. I mean, this episode is proof of that, as I'm notably not doing a story of when they were spot on and got a prediction right. As we will ultimately see, a big part of the story is how and why they got things wrong, which unfortunately is just kind of how things work, as it's easier to say that by getting something wrong, A, B, and C happened as a result, than it is to say by getting something right you prevented X, Y, and Z from happening, because with A, B, and C we actually have tangible evidence to point to, while X, Y, and Z are just speculative. So, with such an obvious screw-up to point to, Morton looked to slash what he saw as the useless Weather Bureau's inflated budget. To do so, he targeted the Bureau's best forecaster, Cleveland Abbé. Morton then ordered Cleveland to basically justify his paycheck. Yet, despite producing a thick packet of reports detailing all he had done over the years, Cleveland's salary would be cut from $4,000 to just $3,000, with a further warning that to keep his pay at this level would require further proof of his skills as a forecaster. To that end, Harrington set up a forecast verification unit that was to be headed by one Major Dunwoody, who also happened to be a vocal critic of the Bureau. Despite this, Harrington himself would ultimately be removed as the head of the Signal Corps in 1895. His replacement, Willis L. Moore, who had spent the previous 2 decades serving in the Corps and as a part of the Weather Bureau, then set about doing what he could to save the organization, which was clearly under siege. Moore then further tightened the reins on his observers and forecasters as he insisted on even stricter verification when it came to forecasts. To that end, he even had his people do practice forecasts for other locations. This way, there would be multiple people regularly creating competing forecasts for any given location. The thing was, this also created a lot of tension within the Bureau's ranks, as they were seemingly in a constant state of competition with basically every other employee in the Bureau. A competition where one's job was seemingly always hanging in the balance should you get a weather forecast wrong. An environment that likely contributed to more Weather Bureau employees being committed to insane asylums than the employees of any other federal agency, a fact that Moore was actually proud of as he shared this little bit of trivia with Congress. In addition to this process, each forecast had to be approved by the Weather Bureau's central office before it could be dispensed to the public, a system which Willis Moore had final say over, all of which was being done in the hopes of restoring or even just establishing the public's trust in the Bureau. To further this campaign, Moore also banned the official use of words like tornado and hurricane as they instilled fear and caused panic. His people were professionals, they were scientists, so the last thing they were to do was to make people afraid. Yet, despite this official stance, Moore would, during the Spanish-American War, seize the opportunity to shine a positive light on his beleaguered Bureau using the threat of hurricanes to do so. You see, the United States Navy was clearly going to have a vital role to play in this campaign. Yet, as Moore would explain, with at least part of this war taking place in the Caribbean, the U.S. Navy was going to be vulnerable to the hurricanes that frequented the region. In fact, after being shown by Moore a map detailing the tracks of past hurricanes, President William McKinley would proclaim, quote, "I am more afraid of a West Indian hurricane than I am the entire Spanish Navy." The exact response that Willis Moore was looking for, as he took the opportunity to suggest that they should create their own hurricane warning system that would have stations in Mexico and around the Caribbean, an idea that McKinley instantly approved of. Now, people have been aware of hurricanes for some time now, with Europeans first encountering them on one of Columbus's voyages when he was caught by surprise by such a storm. This powerful and dangerous phenomenon was new to the colonizers, and as such they were one of the more mysterious meteorological events. Over the years, though, people would begin to piece things together about the nature of these storms, like when in 1821 a 32-year-old saddle maker named William Redfield realized that these storms were some kind of giant whirlwind. Up until this point, no one knew this about the nature of hurricanes, but when one such storm landed in New York City and moved up the coast into New England, Redfield would note while riding through Connecticut that the trees in the northern part of the state were blown over in the opposite direction of trees he'd seen further to the south. After having this revelation, the saddle maker began to study accounts of the storm in various papers and ship's logs, until he became so convinced that he was right that he wrote a paper for the American Journal of Sciences titled, "On the Prevailing Nature of Storms on the Atlantic Coast." Yet, while William Redfield of New England could take credit for recognizing that hurricanes were cyclonic in nature, the place that could rightfully claim to have done the most research into hurricanes and predicting them was Cuba, which makes sense considering that Cuba, due to its size and location, is frequently hit by hurricanes. The people who settled on the island then had a